Somewhere in Cupertino, in the first quarter of 2026, an Apple supply chain engineer signed a component qualification document. Not a headline, not a press conference. A procurement form with a Fab code that most people following the tech industry had never encountered. Contract memory prices, by the accounts of multiple industry analyst trackers, had roughly doubled across certain segments in the first half of that year. That number is not an abstraction. It is the pressure that bends the hand of a buyer who spent years saying a particular address was off the list. One word describes what happened when that hand finally moved. It is not partnership. It is not pivot. It is Tenant. The policy architecture surrounding Chinese memory fabs was built, in part, to keep buyers like Apple at a distance. The shortage of early 2026 did what years of advocacy could not. It opened the door. And qualification is the mechanism that locks it behind you. By the end of this, you will understand why Tenant is the most precise word available, and why precision matters when the lease in question does not expire, when the emergency does. Here is what the memory market actually did. Think of global memory capacity as a water table. In ordinary years, every well pulls what it needs, and no one notices the aquifer dropping. Artificial intelligence data centers drilled a new shaft in 2024 and 2025, wide enough to drop a building into. By early 2026, the smaller wells, the ones supplying your iPhone's memory and your Mac's RAM, were hitting air. Analysts framing the price spike point to a combination of constrained legacy node output and surging demand from artificial intelligence infrastructure, pulling capacity away from consumer device segments. That is a structural explanation, not a single confirmed cause, but the price signal was unmistakable across multiple tracking sources. Apple sources memory from multiple vendors and runs its own qualification process. A qualification adds a supplier to an approved list that persists across product generations. That list, in normal conditions, is conservative by design. I want to be direct about what the early 2026 squeeze tells us. Apple is the most powerful buyer in consumer electronics. It holds leverage over suppliers that mid-tier brands can only imagine. When a buyer with that kind of weight blinks and reaches for a source it had previously avoided, you are not watching a procurement team take a shortcut. You are watching the most powerful buyer in the market run out of qualified road. The squeeze was real, and the alternatives were genuinely exhausted. The two names that matter here are Yangtze Memory Technologies Corporation and Changshin Memory Technologies. Yangtze Memory produces NAND flash and was placed on the United States Entity List in late 2022. A move that restricted American companies from supplying it with advanced manufacturing equipment. That restriction applied to the sell side. The buy side, whether American companies could purchase its output, has been a matter of ongoing legal interpretation and company policy, not a blanket prohibition. Changshin Memory produces dynamic random access memory and has expanded capacity substantially. Reports suggest it is approaching competitive density on mature nodes, though no independent third-party benchmark of yield rate or sustained throughput had been published as of mid-2026. Those caveats matter, and we will return to them. Qualifying a memory supplier is not like switching a streaming subscription. It is closer to a city certifying a new water treatment plant. The city's engineers spend months testing every pipe, every pressure rating, every chemical profile across hundreds of specifications. Once the plant passes, the city does not rerun those tests each year. It turns the tap. For a consumer device manufacturer of Apple's scale, that certification process can span 12 to 24 months. It covers electrical performance, thermal behavior, and reliability across multiple product generation families. Once a fab clears that process, its approved status persists. A new shortage does not require a new qualification. Neither does a price correction in the other direction. Apple had previously pulled back from qualifying Yangtze memory output for its phones in late 2022 under reported pressure from the United States government. The reported partial restart or reversal of that process in 2026 has not been confirmed by Apple directly, but the trade press reporting, taken together, describes something industry significant if true. The first time a top-tier Western consumer platform certified Chinese memory at scale for flagship devices. The purchase order that follows a qualification is almost beside the point. What matters is that the approved list now includes an address it did not include before. That address does not come off the list when the shortage ends. This is where tenant becomes precise. A tenant moves in under the pressure of circumstance. The rent was right, the other options were exhausted. But a tenant who has repainted the walls and integrated the plumbing into daily workflow does not leave the moment the housing market softens. Apple's procurement integration into a Chinese fab, if the qualification reports are accurate, is now infrastructure rather than a transaction. Here's the structural irony I find genuinely striking. The export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment tightened in 2022, and 2023 were designed to slow Chinese memory makers' advancement toward leading-edge nodes. By constraining Chongqing and Yangtze memory to mature and near-mature node manufacturing, those controls pushed both fabs to optimize for cost and yield precisely where consumer device memory lives. Not cutting-edge, high-bandwidth memory for artificial intelligence accelerators. Ordinary, high-volume, cost-sensitive dynamic random access memory and NAND. The exact density and price curve where Apple's volume purchasing sits. The restriction meant to cap Chinese memory at uncompetitive nodes instead pointed Chinese fabs at Apple's address. The wall became a map. 3 counterarguments deserve a real answer. First, Apple has not confirmed any of this. Trade press reports exist. Apple's public sourcing disclosures do not. If the qualification did not happen at the reported scale, the tenant metaphor is premature. Second, Chongqing's node parity claims are the company's own and echoed by some analysts, but no independent benchmark of production volume yield or defect density has been published. A qualification based on early samples could be reconsidered if volume scale quality diverges. Third, United States export controls could be expanded to cover the buy side, making it legally untenable for Apple to continue sourcing from an entity-listed supplier, regardless of qualification status. Apple has pulled back under government pressure before. Weighed together, the policy risk is real, but has not materialized in more than 3 years since Yangtze Memory's listing. The quality question is the most legitimate uncertainty and the one most likely to resolve in Chinese fabs' favor as production scales. And the claim versus proof gap matters less if you treat the qualification event itself as the thing to watch, rather than the purchase order. The thesis does not require certainty. It requires that qualification, if it happened, has the structural properties described. Those properties are not in dispute. The asymmetry is the whole story. It costs years and millions of engineering hours to qualify a fab in, and approximately nothing to keep buying from it once you have. The exit cost is not the reverse of the entry cost, which brings the strategic reframe into focus. In semiconductor procurement, a Tier 1 qualification functions as a de facto industry signal. When the largest buyer on Earth qualifies a new fab, mid-tier buyers treat that as a proxy for their own risk assessment. Picture Samsung and SK Hynix as the 2 anchor stores in a mall that has operated for 20 years. Every smaller brand, every buyer, every allocator oriented around those 2 anchors. Chongqing and Yangtze Memory just opened a 3rd anchor on the other side of the building. The first major brand to move its flagship store next to it was Apple. The other tenants are watching. My read, Chongqing and Yangtze Memory do not need Apple to stay forever. They need Apple to stay long enough that the next tier of Western buyers treats Chinese memory as a qualified option rather than a last resort. Apple is not simply a customer here. It is a certificate of legitimacy, and it handed that certificate over in early 2026 during a shortage it did not cause and could not wait out. A procurement form signed under that pressure is not a geopolitical statement. Apple was solving a procurement problem. But procurement decisions at Apple's scale are geopolitical events, whether or not Apple intends them to be. The qualification an engineer signed in Cupertino may have done more to legitimate Chinese memory on the global market than years of trade policy or state subsidy. The restriction that was supposed to cap Chinese memory at uncompetitive nodes instead optimized those fabs for exactly the volume, price, and density band where Apple lives. Apple did not visit, it became a tenant. And in memory procurement, leases do not expire. They compound. The emergency that moved them in ended. The forwarding address stayed. If Apple's qualification of Chinese memory is the signal that unlocks the rest of the industry's hesitation, which Western device maker do you think moves next, and what would it actually take for any of them to move back out? Leave your read in the comments. If you want to keep tracking the moments where a supply chain footnote turns out to be the actual story, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel exists for exactly that.